So what really shapes our moral compass at work? You ever wonder about that? Is it your age, your experience, something else entirely? Well, back in 1999, some researchers tried to figure that out. But what makes their studies so wild isn't just what they found.
It's a 1999 issue of the Journal of Global Competitiveness. The main corporate sponsor was Enron. Yes, that Enron. And remember, this was published in 1999. Just 2 years later, the entire company would completely implode in one of the most infamous corporate scandals in modern history.
So let's just ignore the giant Enron-sized elephant in the room for a minute. How did these researchers even go about measuring something as fuzzy as ethics? I mean, how do you put a number on integrity?
That was the big problem they had to solve, right? You can't just walk up to someone and say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ethical are you, and expect to get a real answer. They needed a tool, something objective, to actually dig into a person's moral reasoning.
So they used this thing called the Personal Business Ethics Scores, or PBES for short. It's an instrument that was actually created way back in the 1960s, and it's designed specifically to see how people react to certain ethical dilemmas.
And we're not talking about abstract philosophy here. They gave people real-world situations, stuff you could actually see happening at an office. Things like, would you be okay with padding an expense account a little? What about using insider info? Or straight up stealing a coworker's idea? For every scenario, they just had to say whether they approved or disapproved.
The scoring was super straightforward. The more you disapproved of all these shady business practices, the higher your PBES score. So a high score means you have a high sense of personal ethics. A low score, well, you get it. A pretty clean system for a very messy topic.
Okay, so that's the how. They used this PBS score. But the real question, the thing the researchers were really after, was the why. What factors in a person's life could actually predict how they'd score on this test?
They decided to focus on 4 of the usual suspects: a person's age, their gender, whether or not they had management experience, and how much education they had. The whole point was to see if any of these things had a real, measurable impact on their decision-making.
All right, the moment of truth. Let's dig into the results and see what this investigation actually found, one factor at a time.
So the first big question, do we actually get more ethical as we get older? Does life experience and wisdom translate into a stronger moral code?
And wow, the data here is just crystal clear. Look at that gap. The average score for folks 25 and under was about a 32. But for everyone 26 and over, it shot up to nearly 45. That's not just a tiny bump, that's a huge leap. It suggests something really significant changes around our mid-20s.
And the researchers didn't beat around the bush, they came right out and said it. Age is a huge factor. The data pointed to the idea that as we mature as people, our ethical reasoning matures right along with us. So for the first factor, that's a clear yes.
Okay, so age seems to matter a lot. But what about gender? Did the study find any difference in how men and women scored?
And what's fascinating here is what they didn't find. At least for the more mature group, the 26 and overs, the scores were basically identical. You've got women at 45.25 and men at 44.73. In the world of statistics, that's a tie. No difference.
All right, how about professional life? Does becoming a manager, being responsible for other people, actually make you more ethical?
And once again, the data shows a really clear trend. People with no management experience hovered around 43.6. But then you look at managers with 5 or more years on the job, their score bumps up to 45.25. The study suggested that actually leading a team, being on the hook for their conduct, seems to go hand in hand with a higher personal ethical standard, which, of course, makes you think about those very experienced leaders at Enron, doesn't it?
Okay, let's look at our last factor, education. Does going to college, maybe taking a few ethics classes, actually make you a more moral person in the business world?
Well, just like with gender, the answer here was a big nope. I mean, yeah, the college-educated group scored a tiny bit higher, but the difference was so small that it wasn't statistically significant. So according to this study, a formal education didn't seem to be a major player in moral development.
So let's recap. The verdict from 1999 was pretty clear. Age and management experience, yes, they seem to be significant. They mattered. But gender and a college education, turns out not so much.
But the researchers didn't just stop with their own data. They zoomed out to look at the bigger picture, the historical context. And what they found seemed like, well, really good news at the time.
See, they compared their 1999 scores to a similar study that had been done all the way back in 1966. And you know what they found? The average ethics scores had actually gone up over those decades. The takeaway was pretty optimistic. It looked like, as a society, we were slowly but surely becoming more ethical.
And this timeline just lays out the whole tragic story. In 66, you have the baseline. In 99, you have this study saying things are getting better. And then just 2 years later, 2001, the sponsor themselves goes down in a spectacular flameout of fraud and corruption that became a symbol for an entire era.
And this leaves us with a really deep and honestly kind of troubling question. This study looked at individuals and basically found that people were trying to be good. But what happens when you put good, ethical people inside a fundamentally broken and corrupt system? How much does your own personal morality really matter when the system itself is rotten?